I will say that Churchill is my favorite one of these guys. I mean, of all the four, okay, no one likes Hitler and Stalin, with good reason. Roosevelt is an interesting guy, but he's a cipher. He absolutely is. Those of you who were at my talk about Roosevelt, and this is really, I had not quite grasped this until I read a number of biographies about the guy. He just never ever opened up to people, even to Eleanor, very tragically. So you never really, everything he said and did was kind of a put on, which made him the perfect politician. He was very good at telling people what they wanted to hear, but not, I mean, you can tell people what they want to hear pretty easily, but that's a slippery slope to get into as a politician, because a lot of times the next person you run into wants the exact opposite thing, and if you tell them both that they're going to get what they want. But Churchill was very good at sort of saying, this is what's possible and this is what I'd like to do. I mean, this is how he kept sort of African-American labor leaders on side for a lot of the Second World War. He basically said, look, I really am sympathetic to your situation. There are certain things that are possible now and certain things that aren't. And we're going to have to work with the latter. But Churchill, the thing you got to love about the guy was you really, you always knew where you stood with Churchill. Because he would just tell you. He was just full of, he was a very hard on your sleeve kind of guy. And he's also fascinating in the following respect. Well, I'm going to start the talk, and then I'll say that about Churchill, because welcome to the final installation of this year's Major Leaders of World War II. I'm John Foster. I'm a reference librarian here, or an adult information services librarian here at the Mentor Public Library. I also have a doctorate in European history from the University of Washington, specializing in the history of Germany. We come in the sort of last moment to Churchill, and this is really what I was going to say a moment ago, that Churchill was in a fundamentally different situation than any of the other three. The other three were all in sort of rising empires. Hitler thought his was rising a lot longer than it was. Stalin had a pretty good idea of what was going on with the Soviet Union. And Roosevelt, I mean, the United States was in the process of becoming the sort of hegemonic power, taking over from the United Kingdom after the First World War. Churchill, on the other hand, was sort of at the head of a power that was somewhat in decline. And his goal was really to save as much of this as he could. And he came to realize through the course of the war that certain things were just going to go away, but that he had to be the sort of preserver of the British Empire, which he really viewed as one of the predominant forces for good in the Western world. On the 13th of May, 1940, Churchill entered the House of Commons. He'd been appointed Prime Minister 3 days earlier on the 10th, after the resignation of Neville Chamberlain. It was an interesting moment for him. It was a very dark time for Britain, a very dark time in France. The Wehrmacht had punched a hole about 60 miles wide through the French defensive lines. They had attacked through the Ardennes forest, which the French had been absolutely certain they could not do, although with no good justification, since they, I think, knew that the Germans had war-gamed it in the Black Forest earlier on. Churchill had been in the House of Commons on and off since 1900. He had been in the wilderness for a long time, starting in the late 1920s, especially after he switched from the Conservative to the Liberal Party in 1924. In the 30s, he had struggled for influence, but he had, in the course of the abdication of Edward VII, which many of you probably know, he had decided that he wanted to marry an American divorcee. Churchill rose in the House of Commons at that point to sort of argue for more time, that the king should be given more time. He was jeered off the floor by practically everybody. But he had sort of been recouping his fortunes, and then he becomes prime minister after it becomes clear that the Chamberlain government, the war in Norway is going bad, is going badly. The war in France is going badly. Chamberlain finally realizes that his policy, which has been a policy of appeasement and trying to sort of figure out what the Nazis want and give it to them, figure out what Hitler wants and give it to them, Chamberlain finally recognizes that this is a failure, that he's lost the confidence of the government, that he's lost the confidence of the people, and he tenders his resignation. Churchill was a kind of a consensus pick, or a sort of, most people wanted someone else. A lot of people wanted Lord Halifax. Lord Halifax was another one of these big appeasers. But they all sort of agreed on Churchill, who had been a kind of gadfly and a sort of independent-minded member of Parliament for much of the 30s. He had sort of seen the threat of Hitler a lot earlier than a lot of other people, and he had been working for rearmament for a long time. He was still rather unpopular in his own party. Churchill came to the lectern. He started by saying that he was establishing a unity government, that he would bring members of all parties into the parliament or into the cabinet. And he apologized that because of the requirements of time, things were going to have to be done without some of the usual niceties. And then he continued, "To form an administration of this scale and complexity is a serious undertaking in itself, but it must be remembered that we are in the preliminary stage of one of the greatest battles of history, that we are in action at many points in Norway and in Holland, that we have to be prepared in the Mediterranean, that the air battle is continuous, and that many preparations have been made here at home. In this crisis, I hope I may be pardoned if I do not address the House at any length today. I hope that any of my friends and colleagues or former colleagues who are affected by the political reconstruction will make allowances for any lack of ceremony with which it has been necessary to act. I would say to the House, as I said to those who've joined this government, I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. We have before us an ordeal of the most grievous kind. We have before us many, many long months of struggle and suffering. You ask, what is our policy? I will say, it is to wage war by sea, land, and air with all our might and with all the strength that God can give us, to wage war against a monstrous tyranny never surpassed in the dark and lamentable catalogue of human crime. That is our policy. You ask, what is our aim? I can answer in one word. It is victory. Victory at all costs. Victory in spite of all terror. Victory however long and hard the road may be, for without victory there is no survival. Let that be realized. No survival for the British Empire. No survival for all that the British Empire has stood for. No survival for the urge and impulse of the ages that mankind will move forward towards its goal. But I take up my task with buoyancy and hope, and feel sure that our cause will not be suffered to fail among men. At this time I feel entitled to claim the aid of all and say, come then, let us go forward with our united strength. The response was muted, interestingly. The labor benches, who were real opponents of the government and not very much favored by Churchill, applauded vigorously because they had come to believe, as Churchill had, that rearmament was necessary, and they saw the rise of Churchill in this moment as the key turning point. In the conservative benches, the response was muted because they were still not quite sure of Churchill. But I quote this speech at length for the reason that Churchill would make a number of very important speeches that summer, and we'll talk about others of them as we go along. But this, for me, is the key moment in Churchill's career. There were many in Britain at this point, many in the government, who thought that it was still possible that some understanding could have been come to with Hitler. Lord Halifax had said, if Mussolini will deliver a peace offering from Hitler that doesn't involve the absolute destruction of the British Empire, I think we should take it. Churchill said, no, absolutely not. We're going to draw the line here. The Czechs, the Poles, the French have all, in their turn, fallen under Nazi tyranny, but not us. We're going to keep fighting no matter what it takes, for as long as it takes. And this was the sort of moment at which the war turned. Because the British could have, in that moment, knuckled under. Things did not look very good for them and were about to get much worse. But Churchill set the tone that would carry them through the war and carry them to ultimate victory. And for that reason, I think that this is really, of all the speeches he gave, the most crucial one. Churchill was a son of one of the branches of the Dukedom of Marlborough. It had been created as an earldom in 1629 for the Ley family, excuse me. When you read a lot of German, you start pronouncing everything like the Germans do, the Ley family. John Churchill was named Earl of Marlborough in 1689. He was made the first Duke of Marlborough by Queen Anne in 1702. With Eugene of Savoy, he won a victory at Blenheim on the Rhine on 13 August 1704. This is in the War of the Spanish Succession. After which, he was given a plot of land in Oxfordshire where they then built Blenheim Palace. This is John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough. This is Churchill at the Battle of Blenheim, signing the dispatch. It's unclear which dispatch this was, but he's signing a dispatch. You can sort of see. Blenheim Palace was constructed from between 1704 and 1722. If you ever go to the United Kingdom, it's really a fabulous place to visit. It's really beautiful. Churchill was born in November of 1874 at Blenheim Palace. Once again, he was part of the extended family. The real central line of the Dukes of Marlborough is the Spencer Churchill family. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was connected but not in the sort of main line. Randolph Churchill was a really fascinating guy, probably worth a lecture on his own. You can sort of see he goes through a series of important parliamentary positions: Secretary of State for India, Chancellor of the Exchequer, which is basically the financial, Secretary of the Treasury, and then Leader of the House of Commons. And people who go through this series of office, this is usually or very often the precursor to becoming Prime Minister. But Churchill was a bit of a loose cannon. He had also contracted syphilis when he was in college through really no fault of his own. He got sort of pranked by a bunch of his fellow college students, and I'm sure he had some inclination, although the fact of the matter is, with the amount of alcohol being consumed, who knew what was going on? But he was always a sort of kind of at odds with the rest of the Conservative Party, and I think probably because of he didn't support funding to expand the Army and the Navy, which was a very controversial thing in 1886. The British Army, we'll get into this when we get into sort of Winston Churchill's sort of early career, was rather less important than the Navy. I mean, Great Britain is a naval power, and to come out against funding for expanding or maintaining the Navy was just not going to be a very popular position. And then he staged this sort of publicity stunt or whatever, where he resigned very publicly, and I think what he expected was that the leadership of the Conservative Party would come to him and say, no, please don't resign. But I think at that point the leadership said, well, go ahead. I think we can get on quite nicely without you. He died of syphilis in January 1895. This is Randolph Churchill in his college days, and then when he was a member of the House of Commons. He was married to Sarah Churchill, whose maiden name was Jerome. Her father was a New York financier. She was born in Brooklyn. She was startlingly beautiful. The two, even though he came from a fairly well-to-do family and her father was a financier, they always lived beyond their means. Lord Randolph Churchill knew very little about his son. As a matter of fact, at one point, I think couldn't remember how old he actually was. This was not uncommon for the children of people in the sort of upper echelons of society, and not just in Great Britain. This is something I think if you look back at the sort of family history of the wealthy in the United States and France, you'll find much the same thing. They were constantly sort of going to parties and going around and doing this and that. And Winston was enrolled at St. George's School at Ascot when he was 7. It was run by a fellow named Herbert Sneed Kinnersley, who was really a savage. Apparently, he was notorious for giving savage beatings to the boys that sometimes would result in blood and fecal matter being sprayed around. One beating that he received was so severe that he ran away from the school and went to see his nanny, Mrs. Everett, and showed her the scars on his back. And she went to Jenny Churchill and showed her, and she then realized that she had to get him out of there. Several months later, Sneed Kinnersley dropped dead of a stroke, probably all for the best, I think.
Excuse me.
Yes?
You're kind of not standing in front of your screen. We can't see you.
Sure. It's hard for me not to walk around because it's... But so he went to Brunswick School in Hove, which is down near Brighton on the south coast. And that was a sort of more relaxed environment. He was never a very good student. He was very good at things he liked, not at things he didn't like. He also was a sort of troublesome child in the way that children will often be if they're starved for attention. And I think a lot of times he misbehaved because he just did not get the sort of love, affection, attention that he wanted from his family and from people around him. He matriculated to Harrow, which is one of the sort of best of the, what in England are called public schools. We would call them private schools. His grades were so bad, though, that it was clear. Oftentimes, the fact that your grades were bad didn't really make a difference as to whether you could go to Oxford or Cambridge, depending on your. But his grades were so bad that was sort of out of the question. And also, he just was not a very good student, and not rich enough to kind of be at his leisure as other people might be. So he took the entrance examination to get into the Royal Military College at Sandhurst, and he passed it on the third attempt. His father was a little disappointed about this, and the reason was. He then sort of got in the track to be a cavalry officer, and his father really didn't want this because the cavalry is expensive. They don't just give you horses in the British Army. You're meant to sort of, you get 150 pounds a year, which even in 1893 was not that much money. And you were expected to keep 3 or 4 horses, and his father knew that was going to be a great expense. Then his father died, and it became worse for his mother. If you look at the correspondence between Churchill and his mother in the course of the sort of mid-1890s up through when he becomes, up through the First World War, a lot of it is asking for money, or his mother complaining that he spent so much money that she's had to go beg for money from, and she was living in a sort of fairly genteel sort of poverty. She also had, let's be clear, a lot of lovers. I mean, it was quite famous for it. As a matter of fact, Churchill met a number of them and quite liked them. He was commissioned in the 4th Hussars in December of 1895. He took a little, there's Churchill, age 7, by the way, and there's his name is Everett. Right around the time that he graduated, she fell ill and died, and it was very devastating to him. He ended up being the one who organized the funeral for her. This is Churchill in 1895, and there he is on horseback around the same time. I think this is in Bangalore. Being in the British Army was not really like being in the U.S. Army right now. They were a lot more flexible about what you did and where you went. So after he was commissioned, but before he took up his commission and went to India, he got work as a war correspondent and went to Cuba, where the Spanish and Cuban rebels were duking it out in 1895. And this was because he needed money. In fact, if you read practically everything that he ever wrote has been published, and I heartily recommend that you read it. He wrote his own autobiography at the age of when? Tom, do you remember?
51, 52.
Right. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature, if I'm remembering correctly. He was just an absolutely virtuoso-level writer. His early writings tend to be a little bit purple, a little bit florid, but they're still very good. But he really liked to put himself at the center of the action. One thing you really cannot say about Churchill, he did not shrink away from the action, and he wasn't doing this. He wasn't just one of these guys sort of sitting at the back filing dispatches. Like, he really liked to get out and see what was going on. So then he ends up going to Bangalore. First the 4th Hussars went to Bombay, and then they went to Bangalore. And then so the way it was like this. You would have duty from about 6 in the morning until about 10. And then the rest of the day was yours. That was all. So you could ride your polo pony. As a matter of fact, he was a very avid polo player. You could read books. As a matter of fact, Churchill really thought that his education had not been terribly good. So he undertook a program of reading Macaulay and Gibbon and the great classics of English writing. Historical writing, especially because he felt like he needed to improve his intellectual culture. He then starts he's constantly sort of going off to other places, and he finds out that there's a rebellion going on in the Swat Valley. So he goes to Bindon Blood. I forget exactly the nature of the connection. He had some sort of social connection with Bindon Blood. But he got himself attached to the expedition, and then ended up writing a book about it. And all of this was because he needed money. When you went to India in the British Army, you would get a house with 2 or 3 other officers, and you would be expected to live in a certain style. And because he was a polo player, he had to have 4 horses. And they also had to have, several servants and people to cook and people to clean and what have you. So it was a really costly way to live. And the assumption was that you would come up with this money. That it wasn't like the Army was going to come up with it for you. The Army was a little bit of a backwater once again. The Navy was really where it was at in a certain sense. The Army tended to be attractive to more adventurous types, shall we say. So that after his experiences in the Swat Valley, he managed to get Kitchener to include him in the expedition to the Sudan in the summer of 1898. Kitchener thought he was thought he was trying to get medals, or which was probably true. I mean, Churchill was a guy, once again, he was very brave. I mean, he was physically very brave, but he also, once again, needed to get places that he could write pieces that he could sell because he was broke. This is the Battle of Omdurman, in which Churchill took part. He went to England, went back to England. He stood for a parliamentary seat at Oldham. He decided that was what he wanted, was to go into Parliament for the Conservative Party, as his father had done. He lost, and so he was sort of feeling around for something to do, and he decided to go down to the Second Boer War in South Africa. The Boers were the sort of Dutch-based community that lived down there. They were constantly trying to sort of establish their control over the area. It was a very nasty conflict. He went down there to sort of write some pieces. He eventually got captured and put in a sort of military prison in Pretoria, managed to escape, made it 300 miles across the desert to Portuguese East Africa. Yes, thank you. My brain will come around to these things eventually, but it's nice to have a little help. And then wrote a sort of adventure piece about the whole thing. It was, by this time he no longer had a commission, and there was talk that he should get the Victoria Cross for the whole thing, but he was no longer a member of the Army, so they couldn't do it. He then accompanied the British Army when they took Pretoria in 1900, and once again he sort of he was sort of building himself up as a figure in the British public mind. In 1900 he wins the parliamentary seat that he had run for before in Oldham, which is up near Manchester. He joins Lord Hugh Cecil's faction of conservatives, who were called something like the Hugleys or something, or Hugleyites. He was a very odd sort of conservative. I mean, there were things he was very conservative in sort of the social structure of the British Empire, which we'll get into in a little bit. But he had some very liberal ideas too. He was very strongly against tariffs. He was a very committed free trader. Eventually, he switched from the conservatives to the liberals, which made him very unpopular in some circles, as that will do. He was appointed by the Liberal government to be the president of the Board of Trade, and in 1909 he introduced the first minimum wage law in Great Britain. And so this is a sort of interesting moment of the kind of contradictory element of Churchill's outlook. He was very conservative in some ways, but he was very liberal in some ways, and he wanted to. One thing that he very firmly believed was that Britain was made up of a lot of sort of people of the kind of lower orders, and you had to look after them. If the empire was going to survive, those people had to feel like they were getting a square deal as part of the empire, and I think that that's really wherein this commitment to minimum wage comes. He's eventually appointed First Lord of the Admiralty in October 1911. He was the leading proponent of a strategy that involved invading Turkey and coming up at the Germans and the Austrians from the south. This is a theme that recurs with him. Any of those of you who've seen the Churchill biography movie came out, he had a thing about the Eastern Mediterranean. So he and a number of other people, but he, being the sort of prime mover, came up with this idea that they would take the Dardanelles and they would invade Turkey. The campaign beginning in the middle of February 1915. It was a disaster, mostly because of the commanders on the ground being inefficient. The plan needn't necessarily have failed, and really, I say it was a disaster. It was a stalemate in which probably 500,000 people were killed. But from the British perspective, it involved very heavy losses and the gain of not very much. And the stories that the troops told, the British and the Anzac troops told, of being trapped on the beaches at Suvla Bay, where the Turks had their artillery centered in and firing, plunging fire down into the trenches. It was it was like being in a cauldron, basically. Churchill, on the back of this, resigns from the government in 1915. He then joins the army again, is commissioned a lieutenant colonel, and put in charge of the 6th Battalion of the Royal Scots Fusiliers, who are in Belgium at this time. This is the Gallipoli campaign. These are Royal Irish Rifles, I think. This is a British officer looking at Turkish dead above the edge of the trench. These are Anzac troops charging into a Turkish trench, and those are also British troops charging Turkish trenches. This is a pretty remarkable sort of camera angle, because the guy who took it was clearly out in front of a lot of the people who were out there. So this is Churchill. You can see him with the 6th Royal Scots Fusiliers there in the center. And you'll notice here that he's wearing a French helmet. He's not wearing the standard British soup plate helmet that Tommies generally wore. And it was his sort of way of saying that, you know, they were there to kind of save the French, or he had sympathy with the French. He had, just as an aside, he spoke very bad French. He spoke it. It didn't stop him from speaking it, but it was very bad. And there's a really funny story. I recommend to you the Manchester book, because the 3rd volume, I say book, it's 3 fairly hefty volumes, but really very entertaining, extremely well written. And he has a really hilarious description of Churchill trying to sort of make his point to the French general staff as the French are in the process of collapsing in the spring of 1940. And it's funny, because there's a sort of like, at a certain point, one of the French generals later told someone like, well, you know, Churchill said that he thought it was okay if we made a separate peace. And Churchill, who had his sort of, he'd sent a specialist sort of officer who's a native French speaker, to sort of deal with this, said, you know, had the guy say, look, I understand French. These were the words that I said. I understand that I said them badly, but let's be clear. I knew what I meant, and that wasn't it. He is only in the line for a few months. Apparently, he made about 36 forays into no man's land. So once again, he was not one of these guys who was just going to sit in a dugout and let other people do it. He was in the middle of it. He then sort of decides he wants to return to public life. He's appointed Minister of Munitions in 1917, the Secretary of State for War in 1919, then the Secretary of State for the Colonies in 1921, during which time he sort of created Iraq. He essentially drew the map of the modern Middle East with a couple other people over tea one afternoon. I mean, he really and this is how it happened. And we wonder, why are things so messed up there? Well, a lot of it has to do with things the people there did on their own account. But a lot of it has to do with the fact that he put one group of Shiites in one country and another group of Shiites with a bunch of Sunnis in another country. And but that was how, he really thought that the French had this sort of concept of the civilizing mission, the mission civilisatrice, and he really believed that too. There's a sort of funny story, jumps ahead a bit, but he was visiting Roosevelt one time. And Roosevelt, who was a sort of, liked to be a kind of troublemaker, they were having lunch, and he decided to have this journalist in who was a very sort of anti-colonial journalist, and she says to him, well, what do you think of the situation of the Indians? And he says, well, you must mean the native peoples of this country, and these are their problems. And and Roosevelt just thought it was the funniest thing he'd ever seen in his life. But he really felt that Britain had an important civilizing role to play in the colonial world. People tend to poo-poo that now, and I think with some justice, but he's a fascinating character in the sense that, so when the Civil War broke out in Ireland, 1920 and 21, he was one of the people who had them send the black and tans, who were sort of a lot of ex-soldiers who were very brutal to the local populace, and the deeds of the black and tans are remembered. It's what's referred to in Irish history as the Tan War, and very angrily remembered, and with a good deal of justice. But he also eventually became friends with Michael Collins, he was the finance minister, oddly enough, of the Irish Republican Army, but he was really Collins was the most efficient and effective and merciless urban guerrilla leader that's probably ever been seen in Europe. He really, Collins was one of those guys who, he would warn you to get out of the country, but then if he thought you needed to be gotten rid of, he would see it done without worrying about it too much. There's a really interesting sort of moment that they get this, there's a movie about Michael Collins, and he's having this sort of conversation with one of the other people, and they're talking about getting rid of this bunch of British operatives, and the guy says to him, well, the problem is, or Michael Collins says, the problem is we'd have to do it, as if he cared. And in fact, he really didn't. I mean, the one thing you can really say about Michael Collins was that he was pretty cold-blooded about getting rid of people he thought were needed to be got rid of. But Churchill found that he kind of liked the guy. Collins eventually negotiated the Anglo-Irish Treaty, and when he went to sign it, he was standing there with David Lloyd George, and he signed it, and he looked at Lloyd George and said, I've just signed my own death warrant, which is true. He was then later, I think in 1922, assassinated by anti-treaty. And Churchill was sad about this. Churchill really liked it. In a certain sense, it's kind of like his relationship with Stalin. Once he felt like he understood somebody, he was very good at kind of getting rid of the animus. Now, he never lost his animus for Hitler. If you hear the things he says about Hitler, he really absolutely abhorred Hitler, and was fond of saying things that he thought would irritate Hitler. Because they were sort of like, when the war started, they were kind of like trading barbs over the radio at each other. Each one knew what the other's speeches were all about, and Churchill very much liked to sort of make the point to Hitler that he thought he was a really bad guy. Yes, once again, named Chancellor of the Exchequer. Once again, Chancellor of the Exchequer is usually a job that you get on the way to being Prime Minister. Not invariably, but very often. In 1924, he rejoined the Conservative Party, and this is one of my favorite Churchill quotes. Anyone can rat, but it takes a certain ingenuity to re-rat. He was not afraid at all about attacking the government about things that he thought were wrong. And you know how the British parliamentary system works. Basically one party or a coalition of parties has a majority, and they, as long as they maintain that majority, as long as they don't lose votes, they get to stay in power. It's relatively unusual to have somebody like brutally attacking the sitting government from the sitting government's own benches. But he was in a safe seat. He had moved, I'm trying to remember, to Glasgow, I think. But he had very pronounced ideas that were not in sync with the government of Stanley Baldwin, who was the Conservative Prime Minister at that time. Particularly, once again, he thought tariffs were a terrible idea. The Conservative Party at that time was also moving toward home rule for India. Churchill was violently opposed to that. He also was very much opposed to German rearmament, and starting in 1932, I mean, he saw very clearly and very much earlier than a lot of people what the danger was. In the summer of 1936, Edward VII decided that he was going to marry Wallis Simpson, a divorcee from Baltimore. Really, it's hard to know. This was all kinds of wrong. Divorcee is not going to fly with British aristocratic culture. American is a hard sell too, but probably could have been finessed if the divorcee thing wasn't in play. Wallis Simpson was also a bit of a schemer. She really thought that she was going to get to be the queen, and at a certain point, well, I'll tell this story now because we're talking about him. When the conflict broke out in France, he was sort of trapped in southern France, and then he ended up going to Portugal, I think. Edward. This is after he had abdicated. And he sent a note to Churchill in which he said, I'd like to come back to England, and I think I should get this sort of military post, and of course my wife will have to be yada, yada, yada. And Churchill went to the king, and the king's like, I don't want him in England. I don't want him anywhere in this country right now. So Churchill organized it such that he would be the governor of Barbados? Bahamas. Thank you. And that But the deal was that he could not go to the United States. He not only could not go to Great Britain, but he also could not go to the United States. Someone asked Churchill like how he thought Edward VII would take this, how he thought Edward would take it. And he said, well, I think he'll be relieved, not as relieved as the king. Anyway, so while this crisis was going on, Churchill was not paying very close attention to how the discussion of it was going on, and he didn't really realize that the die had already been cast. At the same time, he had started a kind of parliamentary group centered around the idea of rearmament. And they were about to have a big meeting at the Royal Albert Hall where he was going to speak. And then it turned out that this crisis was coming to a head, and he said to the person who was organizing the thing, well, I have to say something about this. And the guy was like, no, you can't have people talking about it. And he didn't. As a matter of fact, like later on, people sort of thought, well, he said this thing in public about the king and whatever, but he didn't actually at that point. But then on the 7th of December, he went into Parliament and he said, well, I think the king should be given some time to make this decision. And he was absolutely jeered off the floor. I mean, from every corner of the House of Commons. And that was, at that point, he became really radioactive. Nobody really wanted to have very much to do with him. He was already kind of an outsider, but this really, he had a kind of circle of people around him, Brendan Bracken particularly, and later on Lord Beaverbrook, although at this point Lord Beaverbrook was a newspaper tycoon. But really he was very much in the wilderness for the last part of the 1930s, and to a no small extent for this reason. But he continued to fight for British rearmament. I mean, it's really fascinating what was going on politically in Great Britain in respect to this period, because we forget now, people say, oh, you know, they should have seen Hitler. But the thing that they really remembered was the Somme. They remembered 20,000 British soldiers being killed in the first day of the Battle of the Somme, and then the Battle of the Somme going on for several months after that. You know, they remember seeing casualty lists with 90,000 names on them. When General Sir Alan Brooke, who at that time was the head of II Corps, the Second Corps of the British Expeditionary Front, was going through northern France and Belgium when the BEF went over to the continent in 1940. He notes in his diary, like, wow, it's really depressing to see these places that I fought in 1916, and here we are again. Baldwin, and then Chamberlain even more after May of 1937, when Baldwin retired, essentially. Chamberlain was really dedicated to the idea of peace, and this was a popular idea, don't get me wrong. Like, it was an easy sell to the British people because they could all remember their husbands and sons coming back maimed or not coming back at all. Churchill at this time had a sort of network of informants. He had, in 1932, I think, convinced the Air Chief Marshal, whose name was Swindon, I think, at that point, this was before Hugh Dowding, to give him the intelligence reports about the rearming of the German Air Force. And Swindon was a little hinky about this because he didn't want, you know, I mean, Churchill was a sort of notorious gadfly. But he did it because he thought, well, a better informed gadfly is if he's going to be saying these things in the House of Commons. But then they kind of forgot to take him off the list. And so he kept getting all this sort of, but he also had a number of other contacts so that he was as well or better informed than the government itself as to what was going on in Germany. He knew that they were rearming at a very alarming rate. A lot of it he couldn't say in public because that would, you know, those of you who've gotten secret information will know that a lot of times you cannot say it in public because that will compromise where you got the secret information from. And his neighbor, whose name was Morton, had a sort of direct source in the Air Ministry, and but was constantly terrified that Churchill was going to say something in public that would make it clear like where his information was coming from. Churchill was a very severe critic of appeasement. I mean, he really saw Hitler for who he was very early, and especially in the Sudeten crisis, when that he thought was the worst sellout Fortunately, he wasn't in the government, so. But after the German invasion of Poland in September 1939, he gets brought into the government as the First Lord of the Admiralty. And once again, this is clearly because it's becoming clear that Chamberlain's policy of peace in our time is really becoming vain, that it's just not going to happen. I don't know why I put this here. This is Chartwell, which is his family home. He liked to go there during the war. His security people were very down on this idea because he was afraid that the Germans would bomb it and get rid of the entire Churchill family at one fell swoop. The first thing that happens, Germans and eventually the Russians, the Soviets, invade Poland in September 1939, and that goes pretty quickly. And then there's a period which is often referred to as the Phony War, or sometimes as the Sitzkrieg, where the Nazi armies on the one side and the French, Belgian, and eventually British armies occasionally traded cannon shots at each other but didn't do much. So some of you may know, but I will just sort of say to frame what happened, is that the French, everybody's always fighting the last war, I'm sure you've heard this. The French decided that they didn't want to be invaded by the Germans again, not surprisingly. So they built a series of fortifications, the Maginot Line, along their eastern border. And they built it as close to the Belgian border as they could, although the Belgians were a little iffy about this, weirdly enough. But they did not cover the Ardennes forest in northeastern France. And the reason was because they believed that German tanks could not go through the Ardennes forest. Although, in fact, the Germans had in 1937 or 38 war-gamed armored advances through the Black Forest, which is very similar in terms of terrain. So the Germans attacked at the beginning of May 1940, and once again it was a sort of two-prong attack. The first one went through Belgium, and the point of this was to get the Belgian army, the BEF, and the French to commit forces up into Belgium. And then the second pincher of the attack, which was much larger, went through the Ardennes forest, and within a very short period of time had torn a gigantic gap in the French lines. Part of the problem for the BEF was that they kept getting, there was just a lot of bad information. French frontline commanders didn't want to admit to their higher-ups how bad things were going, so they kind of padded the information they were getting. But also the French high command was very slow to react. Like, they didn't have a great deal of armor, and they also didn't understand that you have to mass your armor. If you're facing massed armor, you have to mass your armor or you get destroyed piecemeal, which is what happened to them. So at a certain point, toward the middle of May, Gamelin, the French commander-in-chief, decides, well, we're going to have a sort of pincer attack, and we're going to attack the sort of, there's this large bulge, and we're going to attack it from the sides, which is exactly the right plan. They also, the French thought that if the Germans attacked with armor, that it would slow, that eventually they would run out of gas and slow down. But what they did not realize is that the Germans could just stop at any petrol station along the way, fill it up, and keep going, which is exactly what they did. So, but right at that point, Gamelin gets fired by Reynaud, the prime minister, and they bring in Weygand, who's even older and even less with the current tactical situation, and Weygand cancels the order. And then about 4 or 5 days later realizes that the order was the right one, and then reintroduces the order. But by that time it was far too late. By that time the German tanks were sort of romping across the plains of central France. And the British Expeditionary Force was caught up in the sort of northern part of the country. The British Expeditionary Force was led by General Gort. Yes, that's General Gort right there. A very sort of by-the-book soldier, which is interesting given what I'm going to describe in a minute here. On the 24th of May, had not had any information in 4 days from French High Command about what was going on. And Ironsides, the commander-in-chief of the General Staff, commander of the Imperial General Staff, CIGS, came to him with orders from the War Department that said, you're not to retreat to the Channel ports. We want you to attack southward into the German bulge. Well, Gort knew that he would just be annihilated if he did that. So on the 26th, he, on his own recognizance, took the decision that they were going to fight their way back to the Channel ports and not waste time. This is Sir Alan Brooke, General Sir Alan Brooke, later Viscount Allenbrook, who was the head of the Second Corps. Really fascinating soldier, eventually became commander of the Imperial General Staff. When the French army melted away from his right flank, he called up their headquarters and he got the commanding general's adjutant and he said, well, the general's not here and we're sort of bugging out. And Brooke said, well, if I catch him running around in the battle area, I'm going to have him shot. And he was not joking. Brooke and Gort and Adams, who was the head of the other half of the BEF, then managed to stage one of the really great fighting retreats in the history of modern warfare. The BEF, along with French and some Belgian units, fought by day, retreated by night. And there were these moments of incredible heroism where the 1st Coldstream Guards held the line for 36 hours to allow the forces behind them to retreat and then stage an orderly retreat behind them. There was I think it was the 1st Cameroons were reduced from battalion size to about 40 effectives, staged a counterattack that pushed the Germans back across the Canal de la Lava, buying more time for the retreat. I mean, if you read the history of it, there are these incredible stories of, I think the British get a sort of bum rap in a way, like American stories about the Second World War are about what we did. And I think it's worth remembering the incredible heroism of the soldiers of the BEF in this particular moment. So you can see this is 21 May. This is the German advance since the 16th, and this is the sort of pocket that the BEF, these are BEF units, there's the Belgian Fourth Army. The British counterattack on 21st May, but it makes some territory, but it's really thrown back. And then by the 4th of June, they get pushed back. And Dunkirk is the only of these, of Calais, Gravelines, Boulogne, Newport, Ostend. Dunkirk is the only port that they can get to. And Dunkirk was a terrible place to try and exfiltrate at. I really recommend, by the way, seeing the movie that's just come out. It's really fabulous. It didn't really have a good way to get people to boats or boats to people. There was something called the East Mole, which was a long sort of wooden jetty. Normally those things are made out of stone. In this case, it was made out of wood. And what you had was hundreds of thousands of men crowding the beaches. The 3rd, I believe, of January, Churchill was talking to one of his fellow, one of the members of the military cabinet and said, would you be satisfied if we managed to get 50,000 of them out of there? And he said, I think that would be a great result. And then, for those of you who've seen the movie will know, and those of you who've heard the story, the British mobilized not only a large proportion of the military ships that were in the area, but also a large proportion of civilian ships from the southeast coast. And in the course of 9 days, managed to get 334,000 troops off that beach. The war couldn't have been won on that day, but it sure could have been lost. That was crucial. And not only did they get 270,000 British troops, but they also brought a large proportion of the French rearguard, 220,000 British troops, a large portion of the French rearguard, which formed the sort of central piece of de Gaulle's reconstituted Free French Army in the UK in the time after the fall of France. On June 4th, when the French were in the process of capitulation, Churchill kept flying over to sort of visit the French government and try to sort of like regenerate their martial spirit. But really, most of them were trying to sort of look for an excuse for why it wasn't going to work. But as the sort of Dunkirk evacuation was in progress, Churchill gave a speech in which he said, I have myself full confidence that if all do their duty, if nothing is neglected, if the best arrangements are made as they are being made, we shall prove ourselves once again able to defend our island at home, to ride out the storm of war, and to outlive the menace of tyranny, if necessary for years, if necessary alone. At any rate, that is what we are going to try to do. This is the resolve of His Majesty's government, every man of them. That is the will of Parliament and the nation. The British Empire and the French Republic, linked together in the cause and in their need, will defend to the death their native soil, aiding each other like good comrades to the utmost of their strength. This, once again, he was sort of directing this at the French government, trying to sort of get them to pick up the ball. Even though large tracts of Europe and many old and famous states have fallen, or may fall into the grip of the Gestapo, and all the odious apparatus of Nazi rule, we shall not flag or fail. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. And even if, which I do not for a moment believe, this island or a large part of it were subjugated and starving, then our empire beyond the seas, armed and guarded by the British fleet, would carry on the struggle until, in God's good time, the new world, with all its power and might, steps forward to the rescue and the liberation of the old. These are British Tommies on the beach at Dunkirk. You can see that they're shooting at a plane overhead, which does almost no good, but probably makes you feel better about things. You can also see explosions here out in the water. So just to get back to the speech for 1 second, clearly what is the point of this speech? One is, once again, we're not giving up, period. Like France, sorry, we expect you to keep the fight going, and they'd made an agreement not to make a separate peace, which the French then broke. But who are they looking to for help? Eventually it's going to be us. This is from the beaches at Dunkirk. You can see hundreds and hundreds of thousands of guys lined up. This is a French destroyer with about 1,500 soldiers on board that's just gotten torpedoed. In fact, another French destroyer was nearby, and most of them were actually rescued. But there were a number of cases in which boats with anything up to 3,000 people were torpedoed or hit mines in the channel and were destroyed. In the wake of the Dunkirk evacuation on the 16th of June, 1940, Churchill once again reiterated his commitment to continuing the fight. However matters may go in France, with the French government, or with another French government, we in this island and in the British Empire will never lose our sense of comradeship with the French people. If we are now called upon to endure what they have suffered, we shall emulate their courage, and if final victory rewards our toils, they shall share our gains, aye, and freedom shall be restored to all. We abate nothing of our just demands. Czechs, Poles, Norwegians, Dutch, Belgians, all who have joined their causes to our own shall be restored. What General Weygand has called the Battle of France is over. 16 June was the sort of moment of the French capitulation. The Battle of Britain is about to begin. Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization. Upon it depends our own British way of life and the long continuity of our institutions and our empire. The whole fury and might of the enemy must be very soon turned on us. Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be freed and the life of the world may move forward into broad sunlit uplands. But if we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, including all that we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age made more sinister and perhaps more protracted by the lights of perverted science. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties and so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour. Once again, Churchill had this way with compelling words. He was his delivery took a bit of getting used to, which is why I'm sort of reading this rather than playing the speeches. But there was a great feeling in England at this point that, or in Britain generally, that fine, now we are on our own. Newsboys in London who used to would chalk the headlines on slates in front of their stands, chalked in the wake of the French capitulation, we're in the final, match to be played on home ground. And so there was this real feeling among the British public, or a very large segment of them, that they were now in this fight and that they were going to stick it out to the bitter end, whatever that might be. Hitler then sort of resolved that he was going to invade Britain. But the problem was, number one, he didn't resolve it immediately. What he assumed was that the British would see the light of reason and just come to terms, right? Because there's no way they can hold out against our fabulous armies. And all through late May and most of June, he kept, telling his flunkies, well, any minute now the British will come to us with a proposal. We can sort of put this all behind us. Boy, I misspelled blitz. That's really not very good. Sorry for being in a hurry. And in fact, the Germans had never come up with a plan for invading England. They really had never thought that it was going to be necessary because, okay, the British, they're maybe not like as good of Aryans as we are, but they're Aryans, right? We can sort of work with what they are. And also, he didn't want to destroy Britain because he thought that then either the United States or Japan would grab their empire, and he didn't. So what he wanted to do was come to an agreement with the British so that they would sort of get on side. But of course, Churchill was completely unwilling to countenance that. And so finally, Hitler starts sort of planning for the invasion, which he dubbed Operation Sea Lion. And he told the German Navy, well, we're going to need to get 150,000 troops over to various places on the south coast. And the German Navy said there's not a chance. It would take every merchant ship that we have. Like, they didn't have any landing boats. They didn't have the resources necessary to do it. And by the way, we would be subject to British air power on the way over there. So Goering says, well, it's okay, Adolf. I've got this. Goering, so most of you probably know, but I'll just mention, was a World War I fighter ace who had been in the von Richthofen's Flying Circus and had actually taken over command after von Richthofen was killed. He knew very little about actual tactics, oddly enough. I mean, large-scale tactics. And there was a common belief that had gotten going in the 30s that bombers were going to be the sort of decisive thing in the next war, because you couldn't stop them from bombing your cities to rubble. And so Goering had focused German aircraft production mostly on building bombers. They did build a pretty good fighter, the Messerschmitt Bf 109. It had it used fuel injection, so it could dive better than the Spitfire or the Hurricane, and oftentimes it could dive so precipitously that it could get away from a Spitfire or a Hurricane. But it was not the world's fastest plane, and it was not very heavily armored. This is the great thing about, by contrast, Sir Hugh Dowding, who is the Air Chief Marshal, he had been appointed in 1936, I believe, and he was not very well liked among the rest of the people in the British military establishment. I mostly thought he was kind of an odd duck. But what he was convinced was that fighters were really going to make the difference. And so while the rest of the air service is demanding more money to build bombers, Dowding keeps funding directed toward building more Hurricanes and the development of the Supermarine Spitfire. I will just say, since I have a minute here, Spitfire was a great plane, but a little bit, it took sort of real expertise to fly it, especially because at high speed it liked to shimmy because it had very wide wings. And if you were not careful about what you were doing, it was very easy to stall it. Still, it was a very good plane. The Hurricane, every time I think about this, I have one of those "we are not the men our fathers were" moments. Like, really, the idea that you would jump in a Hurricane and, those guys like heading skyward to give battle to the Luftwaffe it's very moving. The Hurricane started out as a fabric wing plane, and then they decided that they were going to cover the wings in metal, and they put armor between the pilots, the cockpit, and the engine, and then finally some behind. And then they also gave it a bulletproof canopy. And it was one of the safest planes around. It was kind of, for those of you who remember when I talked about the Battle of Midway, and how American pilots really loved the Hellcat, because it was a very survivable plane. The Hurricane was really a survivable aircraft. And British pilots loved it. And in the hands of a expert level pilot, it was a lethal plane too. I mean, there's a reason, this is one big reason that the British managed to come out on top here. So Goering kind of slowly ramps up over the course of the summer of 1940. And the idea is that they'll build up to what they call the Adlerangriff, or the Eagle attack, during which what they're going to do is try and destroy all the airfields along the southern coast of England, so that the British won't be able to send interceptors to stop the invasion. The British had a very rudimentary form of radar, which the Germans had never really got with at that point. And Hugh Dowding, the real hero of this moment, because he also set up a series of radar posts all the way down across the Severn Estuary and up into Wales. And then a bunch of smaller ones, so like the sort of the larger radar installations could see planes 150 miles out, but once they came in, so they needed smaller ones. And they had a series of integrated control centers where they would be sort of mapping out where the planes were. I mean, it was just incredibly extensive. They had also broken the German code, MK Ultra, not Ultra. Say it aloud. Enigma, not Ultra, but Ultra was another, but Enigma, yes. And so they really had a very good idea of what was going on. A lot of times, too, they knew because they could hear the German pilots when they would get up in the air and formed up. They could hear them say, "Okay, we're all formed up," and they would say who they were. And they'd say, "Oh, yeah, so now we know, 5 swarms are coming," because they all said, "Okay, I'm in position now." These are Heinkel bombers. These referred to by the British as flying pencils. You can see they're flying very low, and it's because they were a terrible plane and had to fly low to keep from getting shot out of the air. These are Hurricanes. You can kind of tell by their slightly larger tail. And then these are Spitfires. You can tell because they have the flat-end canopy. This is taken from a Spitfire's wing camera. And you can see the bullet trails as they're putting bullets into a Henkel 110 bomber. The German strategy became that they were going to bomb German cities. First they started with London, then they started to move to the other larger industrial cities. They really took a bite out of Coventry. You can see London burning, St. Paul's Cathedral. This is the Aldwych tube station. When the air raids happened, people would go down into the subway station, which was a pretty safe place by and large. These are financial workers going through a bombed out part of London. And here's Churchill in the East End. The East End took a real beating. The East End is a sort of very working class part of London, and it was close to the Docklands. And that was the one thing that the Germans really wanted to bomb very extensively. But Churchill really made it a point to get down into these areas and to talk to the people. And also during air raids, it drove his security people nuts. He would put on his helmet and go up onto the top of his office building. He didn't stay in number 10 Downing Street for most, which is the Prime Minister's residence. But he would go out on the roof and he would sort of watch what was going on. And his security people were my God, what are you trying to, it'd be really terrible for us if you dropped a bomb on you right now. But he just absolutely wouldn't be stopped. Here's Churchill again in the East End of London. Here's Churchill with a Sten gun, and you can see his security guy. But he was a former police detective who had retired and was sort of brought out of retirement to be Churchill's security guy. And Churchill used to drive him completely crazy because he'd be constantly going off and doing this and that. This is the center of Coventry, the bombing, which I believe was in November of 1940. This is Coventry Cathedral. You can see Churchill. So a lot of what Churchill was doing in this time, aside from trying to organize the defense of Great Britain, both the home country and also in the Far East against the Japanese, was, and let's remember the war in the Far East started a long time before, it started in 1936, was trying to convince us to come into the war. But of course, Roosevelt, who I think was sympathetic to this idea, was handcuffed by the fact that Congress had passed no less than 7 neutrality measures in the course of the 1930s. And he was constantly Churchill was constantly trying to get us to come in or to do something. But Churchill, Roosevelt couldn't really do anything about it. He wanted to. And at a certain point, he started kind of selling the British our old destroyers, very outdated. But the sort of price of doing it was that we got all these bases in Newfoundland and whatever, and the other people in the British government kept going to Churchill and saying, well, you're kind of selling off the British Empire here. This is not cool. But what does he say? What is he supposed to do? On the 9th of February, 1941, Churchill gave a radio address sort of in honor of the fact that Wendell Willkie, who was a Republican politician and the sort of loser in the most recent election, had come over as sort of Roosevelt's emissary, in which Churchill said, "The other day, President Roosevelt gave his opponent in the late presidential election a letter of introduction to me, and in it he wrote out a verse in his own handwriting from Longfellow, which he said applies to you people as it does to us. Here is the verse. Sail on, O ship of state, sail on, O Union strong and great. Humanity with all its fears, with all its hopes of future years, is hanging breathless on thy fate. What is the answer that I shall give in your name to this great man, the thrice chosen head of a nation of 130 millions? Here is the answer which I will give to President Roosevelt. Put your confidence in us. Give us your faith and your blessing, and under Providence all will be well. We shall not fail or falter. We shall not weaken or tire. Neither the sudden shock of battle nor the long-drawn trials of vigilance and exertion will wear us down. Give us the tools, and we will finish the job." And this is his sort of way of trying to get around the American isolations. We don't want your sons to come over here. Just give us the guns, give us the planes, give us the tanks. We'll do it. We just need your help. So very shortly after that, you can see on March 11th, Roosevelt signed Lend-Lease, which was a kind of a fiddle. Those of you who know Lend-Lease, like his rationale for it was not, I don't think technically legal, but that's okay. He was doing something that needed to be done, and sometimes that's what it takes. Roosevelt and Churchill found that they rather liked each other. They were both sort of from patrician backgrounds. They had both had very lonely childhoods. And when they came to meet at Placentia Bay on the coast of Newfoundland in August 1941, they really found that they quite enjoyed each other's company. Churchill found Roosevelt a little bit maddening because he wouldn't move as quickly. Also, Roosevelt was one of those people who was always slightly more familiar than was probably, so he referred to Churchill's wife, Clementine, as Clemmy, which was Churchill's pet name for her, and Churchill was very put off by that, and I understand that. At that meeting, they signed the Atlantic Charter, which is basically the sort of blueprint for the post-war world. It's a really interesting negotiation process because, on the one hand, the Americans are very interested in pushing sort of self-determination for nations, which Churchill is okay with, unless you mean India. And so he had to walk a very fine line because he didn't want to give away the British Empire. He knew by this point that he was fighting a rearguard action. And once we got into the war several months later, it became very clear that sort of once Roosevelt was in, he also decided that he was the leading player here and that he was willing to consult with Churchill, but that he really viewed himself as the sort of as the decider, if you will. Pearl Harbor, 7 December 1941. Churchill found out about this at dinner at Chartwell. They heard that there had been an attack, but they thought it had been on the Pearl River in China because it was sort of garbled, and they couldn't figure out why American ships had been there. And it wasn't for several hours until they found out. Churchill went back to London and found out what had happened, immediately sent Roosevelt a message of support. And Churchill was not gleeful about it, but he recognized that now the war was going to be won. I will say, too, that when he had this sort of long-scale negotiation going on with Stalin, and he kept sort of trying to convince Stalin that Hitler was going to double-cross him, weirdly enough. Weirdly enough, Stalin was not interested in that idea, even though it's perfectly obvious to anyone looking at it from the outside. But when the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union, Churchill had orders that he was not to be woken before 8. And then finally, sort of 8 rolls around, and one of his cabinet secretaries comes in and wakes him up and tells him what's happened. And he was just overjoyed because he knew that it was a complete blunder, and that now the Soviets would be brought into the war as a sort of major player. And in his memoirs, post-war memoirs, he wrote of the sort of moment, "Eastward ho," because he just thought it was great that the Nazis had decided to do this, because it was a terrible. Everyone knew it was a terrible idea. Churchill, I will say too. So, as far as books go, I'm going to get to the sort of finishing punchline of this lecture. But I will say, as far as books go, I recommend Manchester's biography, 3-volume biography. Once again, it's very hefty, but it's really pleasant to read. I really enjoyed it, and I think you will too. There's a book called The Man He Became. The Man He Became? Yeah, about his young life. His autobiography, Tom, remember me the title?
My Early Life.
My Early Life, yeah, of course. Which is great and really beautifully written. And then his war memoirs that he wrote afterwards. People asked him why he didn't keep a diary. And he said, well, I might get things wrong. I mean, how do I know today what the significant, how would I know that, like, I write something today and it won't turn out to be wrong tomorrow. Sir Alan Brooke, who was the commander of the Imperial General Staff, did keep a diary. And then when Churchill published his war memoirs, Brooke felt like Churchill had gotten some things wrong. And so he hadn't meant to publish his war diary, but he did. I really recommend that book too. I'm going to try and find it for the library. It's a little on the longer side, but it's a diary, so it's a quick read. But Brooke is a really fascinating guy, has really interesting little sort of vignettes about all the people he met, and he met everybody. I mean, Stalin and Chiang Kai-shek, and I mean everybody involved. He said, Brooke said, this is one of my favorite things, "Never have I admired and despised a man simultaneously to the same extent. Never have such opposite extremes been combined in the same human being." And what he was talking about was everybody thought that Churchill was some sort of strategic genius, and he really was not. He kept being like, well, we've got to invade Norway. He would just go on and on about this. And partly he felt bad because of sort of the Nazis had pushed them out of Norway and he wanted to get back. And he also wanted to invade the Balkans and go up that way. And one reason he wanted to do this was because he thought that this would put a brake on the Red Army taking over everything between the Western Soviet border and everything else further west. But once we got involved, and especially once Eisenhower got involved, Eisenhower was like, no, we're not going to do that. We're already having a bad enough time in Italy. So when we do this invasion, it's going to be straight across the Channel into Normandy. We're not going to go to some far-flung place. We're going to get all our people together. We're going to go straight across. And in the sort of debates about this was the sort of moment at which Churchill kind of realized the Americans really think I'm second banana here. But he was okay with that because his number one goal was to rescue the British Empire, and he knew that this was how it was going to be done. Now, you may think I've sort of gone quite precipitously through the later parts of the war. I talked about the series of conferences, particularly at Tehran. Tehran is an interesting conference in the sense that it was in Tehran because Stalin would never fly anywhere. Stalin was terrified of flying. So he had to go somewhere that he could get to by land. Roosevelt, by this time, was beginning his sort of downward spiral. But the sort of interesting thing about the Tehran conference is that Churchill plays the kind of negotiator, the sort of realist among the people who have sort of bigger ideas. Also, one reason that Churchill and Stalin liked each other was that they were both very heavy drinkers. Churchill would usually start the day with a glass of sherry, and then have a few glasses of champagne over the course of the day, and then maybe move on to liquor later on. And he was usually up to 1 or 2 in the morning. So the Soviets, when they like to sort of have these meetings, like to sort of have everything kind of heavily lubricated with vodka. And Churchill was one of the few people, fortunately for our sake, Roosevelt was also a very heavy drinker. So not everybody could sort of hang with the Soviet party, so to speak. Churchill was constantly wanting to see what was going on, or constantly wanting reports from the army from the U.S. Army about what was going on, because once the U.S. Army took control, they were a little closed-mouthed. And they kept saying, well, no, no, no. And finally, Churchill told Eisenhower, either you give me regular reports, or I and my entire cabinet are going to go to the front line and see for ourselves. Eisenhower was like, oh my God, no, that's fine. We'll come to some sort of arrangement now. By the time of the German surrender, we're getting around to the UK has not had an election in about 10 years. And Churchill sort of sees the writing on the wall. The Labour Party had said that they would not participate in a coalition government anymore. And so Churchill resigns on the 23rd of May, so he's not president in official capacity at the Potsdam Conference. But one interesting thing is that before he does it, Churchill was very well aware of the danger of the Red Army. And so he had Brooke and some of the other people at the general staff come up with an operation for what it would be involved, like attacking the Red Army in case the Red Army decided to kind of come into Western Europe. And it was called Operation Unthinkable. And finally, someone, convinced him that this wouldn't be it. That we needed to sort of talk our way through this rather than this. But it's well to remember that even before the end of the war, there was a very pronounced consciousness among the Allies that the Red Army was the next real problem, that the Soviets were the next real problem. So Churchill had a fairly extensive post-war career. He was prime minister again in the 50s. But this was really, of all the men who led the major Western states, we can sort of put aside Asia, not that it's unimportant, but just to sort of, for the sake of focus here. Churchill, I think, is in a way the most remarkable. Roosevelt has been in power for a long time. So is Hitler for about exactly a long time, and Stalin even longer. Churchill comes to power in the absolute crucial moment, at the absolute hour when he was the person who could save the British Empire. And by saving the British Empire, let's be clear, he really saved the world. Because if Hitler had been allowed to continue his policies unabated, the situation would have gotten much, much worse. So it was only because Churchill was absolutely adamant that there would be no negotiations with Hitler that we were able later on, and I say we, I mean the United States, was able later on to come in and work such good effects. And this is why I find Churchill in a way the most fascinating, because he was the one who had to sort of construct his policy and his government in the shortest period of time. He had a period of a week or two before things really, things were already going south in France by the time he got into power, but they really went south within less than a month. And he's a fascinating guy in the sense that he was very, he really had convictions in a way that I don't think the other three did. And this is no disrespect to Franklin Roosevelt. I have a lot of respect for him. Roosevelt, I think, did what he did in the New Deal for technical reasons rather than intense, conviction. I doubt that Hitler really could have spelled conviction, except as relates to his own perfection. And Stalin was a habitual liar and really, thought mostly about what he could do for himself. Churchill, there's a sense in which the whole lecture series has been about what it involves to lead, what it involves to be put in the position of leadership in these crucial moments. And of all these four figures, Churchill is the one who leads most effectively, who has the greatest difficulties to overcome, and the one who, looking back at his career, I think we can say, provides, I think, arguably the greatest model for what we should expect from political leadership in times of crisis. So I think that's what I have. Thank you for coming. If you have questions, I am ready to take them.